Alright guys, it's time for the scumble. So there's going to be a lot of painting that's going to happen in this stage. I'm going to basically repaint the entire face. I'm going to keep my shadows on the thinner side, but I will still be painting back into the shadows to do a little bit of color correcting, a little bit of cooling down, but I'm going to keep those colors mostly on the translucent side. I'm going to begin working in the middle tones, which is um, kind of the darkest part of the light area. It's kind of the transition of light and shadow almost is the way that you think about it. Kind of in between the light and shadow, but just a little bit more on the light side. So that's more the middle tones. Those are the coolest tones that you'll see in form. And I'm going to start with those. And then I'm going to build a bit thicker into the lights, um, and I'm going to work thinner into the shadows. But I'm going to start in the middle and work to light and then work to dark, and there'll be a bit of back and forth in there. Um, and things to keep in mind is that I have taken some steel wool to the surface here, and I've basically just rubbed it, given a little tiny bit of elbow grease because I'm working with some pretty delicate steel wool here, but just kind of rubbed it on the surface. And you probably won't be able to see this in the video as I've tried to reduce glare in the video, but in doing that, the surface has become just a little bit more matte and a bit less glossy. And the steel wool is a really delicate way to do this. I mean, you can use some sandpaper too. The steel wool is a much softer way of getting that effect. And that effect is so that you get rid of the gloss once again so that you can, so that the paint will bind nicely to the surface. Paint binds better to a matte surface than a glossier surface. And it just helps to get rid of a little bit of the excess oil that is on the surface as well. In addition to that, the surface has been let dry for probably 3 or 4 days at this point, so it's pretty solidly dry because I'm using liquid that's speeding the drying time a decent amount. And what I'm going to do first, sort of the properties of a scumble, is that you're using opaque paint, but you're adding just a bit of your painting medium into it. That would be linseed oil or walnut oil or liquid or whatever kind of concoction that you have. And that little bit of oil that you're adding into the opaque paint is going to add just a nice little bit of translucency to it. The scumble typically is done with opaque paint, but applied semi-thinly so that you have this translucent effect. And like I said, I'm gonna start that way in these middle tones. I'm gonna work that way, probably a little bit even thinner than that in the shadows. But then in the lights, I'm going to work in an impasto, which means just thick paint. So I'm going to really start to develop more surface, a more texture in the light areas that may end up translating a little bit into some of those shadow areas. I don't really know yet. I'm going to kind of feel it out as I go. That's kind of the way I typically like to paint. So I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants just a little bit, but still have this concrete process I'm working with. Also, I've tried to set up in this really awesome way my palette on top of my trusty toolbox with a little 2.5-pound weight here to kind of keep this in place so that you guys can see the colors that I'm mixing and the colors that I'm grabbing on this palette as I'm actually doing it, so I don't have to narrate exactly what colors I'm mixing up all the time. So hopefully you guys will be able to see all of this, but let's get started. Alright, to start off here, I am not going to put oil directly on the surface like I did with the glaze. That was a really important part of the glazing stage, to make sure that the paint flowed really nicely across the surface. However, with this scumble, I actually want more of the more of the underpainting to kind of show through some of these cracks that will happen um, as I put the paint on. As the brush drags across the surface, there are areas that won't be completely filled in because there is texture to this and there's texture to the bristles. So there will be little bits of this underpainting that just kind of happen to show through, and that is something that I want in the painting. And if the surface is really slick and wet from the uh, from from the oil put on it, then it will fill in those cracks a little bit more and just get a different kind of brush stroke than I actually want right now. So, uh, I took a mixture of white, ivory black. I used a little bit of the cadmium lemon. I'm going to hit it with just a little bit of warmth. But you see, I'm mixing up something that's like almost just as gray as my palette right now, quite gray. And just directly mixing the oil into that, being mindful of about how much I have. Use just a touch of this solvent just to give it a little bit more flow. I'm actually picking a dead hair out of the brush, but getting kind of a lighter application of paint on this brush right now. And now I want to see what this looks like. See what this value kind of looks like right now. Pretty good to start. Maybe just a touch dark, but let's move it around a little bit and see, because that value will change depending on what area, or the necessary value will change depending on what area I'm painting in. So I'm being kind of delicate with this right now. Like I said, the paint is still fairly opaque because there's a lot of white in this mixture. But it's being spread around in a way that is allowing a lot of those underpainting colors to show through. A lot of those glazes and stuff to still show through. So right now I'm really just focusing on these middle tones, trying to see where those really nice, cool shapes are. And I would say if you're struggling to see these middle tones, I would just put them in where you know they are. Okay? They are between light and shadow. Where light and shadow meet is where you will have these middle tones. So I would recommend that you basically put them in those shapes, even if you don't quite see them yet, because sometimes you just need to put it on the surface to be able to start to see these things. I know that happens a lot with my students in class. They can't see something until I put it down, and then they're like, okay, yeah, I see that now. So what I'm telling you is that these middle tones appear in between the light and the shadow, and you have my permission to just put them in, even if you're not fully aware of them yet. Because even if you're getting a little bit too cold in that area right now, by just putting that in, you're going to be painting on top of this stuff anyway. So a lot of these colds are going to get warmer as you work anyway into the light areas and build up more of your form. So I would say push it a little bit more than maybe you naturally would. Let's see. this table. There we go. I'm going to move this off a little bit. So every time I was painting, it was rocking my mirror because my toolbox happened to be hitting the hitting the table. All right. So we're really starting to develop some of these nice cool tones now. I'm definitely getting more excited about the color at this point. Part of the glazing stage frustrates me a little bit just because I want to put in a bit more of those cool tones as I'm going, but it's just not quite the most opportune time for them. So I leave the glaze stage as it is, but now that I'm working in the scumble, I can start to push some of these nicer cool tones. And this really starts to round out the color in a nice way. And the reason I let the glaze dry instead of doing this in the last layer is just because when that glaze dries, it kind of locks in all of that color. And the way you build the color on top of locked in color that's set and dried, is just different than if you work all of that color while it's wet. So that's why just trying to be disciplined and let that glaze actually sit on the surface and dry the way that it should. Because now that I'm putting these cooler colors on top, they're reacting to the glazes that are underneath and just creating overall more color complexity in the painting than if I had just done it all in one layer and just worked those cool tones in the glaze stage, which actually is a bit more what I did here in the shirt. So I'm going to change my approach just a little bit in this scumble stage in the shirt. We see still just working these nice, cool middle tones. Really a lot of wonderful color here. There's also on the edges. On the edges is where you will have more of that cool color, that coolness on the edge of the form, like where the form kind of rolls around, like rolls in space. It rolls on the edge of the neck, it rolls on the edge of the ear, it rolls like within the ear as well. You know, it rolls on the edge of the nose, all that kind of good stuff. Where you want that form to roll around, you put those nice grayer colors in there, and you'll have a lot of nice rolling form that'll happen because of that. Those cool tones really work well for rolling that form in space. Let's get a little bit punchier here. Might just get a little bit funkier with my color, just because I know I'm going to be hitting this with a lot of thicker paint anyway that will give me plenty of coverage. I'll be able to really cover up this stuff if I need to. Getting a little bit funkier with my color may just provide me with some not quite happy accidents, but you know, something similar to that. Just some color notes that maybe I wouldn't have gotten if I was being a bit more conservative. And there is going to be a lot of cooling down that's going to happen in these shadows. Maybe I will start working And I have some light hitting the edge of my face over here. I think I will start to work in that area right now. Let me go ahead and get that in. All right, now I'm going to move into the light areas. I have a couple of larger brushes cleaned and ready for this task because I want to start working with some bigger brushes and really start to bring out the light on here so that we can start to see where this value structure is going, because right now these lights are definitely too dark. So what I'm going to do now is build out of these middle tones to get these nice lighter values in here. I'm going to start working a little bit more directly with my color. I'm going to look more for the color that I see in front of me and try and get a bit more of those wonderful you know, vibrant colors as well as lighter values. Though I am going to reserve just a little bit of the color in order to do some more with glazes on top. So let's get into that work. And at this point, I'm still gonna use a little bit of liquid mixed in with my paint, but not quite as much as what I was using in the glazes. Because right now I'm going to start working a bit more with the thickness of the paint, and I'm going to start building instead of relying on a lot of what was already down, a lot of the color that's already on the surface of the painting. As I'm painting this, I'm trying to identify differences in big colors and values. Like as I'm working my way down here, I see up here by my temple, this color gets a bit cooler, a bit greener. As it goes further up, which I haven't actually painted yet, it gets a bit more orange and warmer. Then as it starts to move a little bit more into these middle tones, it starts to get a little bit redder and then a bit more violet as it really gets into some of these areas. And like I said, I haven't quite painted all that yet, but that's what I'm looking for. Is I'm looking for these transitions. As this light moves down here, this area gets a bit pinker and a little bit grayer than the forehead area. The forehead area has more warmth, has more orange. This has more pink and more gray. And I'm just looking at myself in the mirror to kind of to get those relationships and to understand them before I just start putting a bunch of paint on. So that's what I'm doing as I'm putting on all these shapes. I'm also, as I'm working the nose, I'm looking at these colors and values in relation to these colors and values. So I'm comparing this shape to this shape, and you know, the point really is that I'm comparing my shapes to other shapes and colors so that I can get an understanding of them in relation to other things. And that is going to give me much better color variation overall, much better understanding of the color, is to understand them in relation to these other shapes. So as I go, I'm going to need to lighten this a little bit here as well. But let's keep working. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what I've been doing here. So for the past few minutes, I've been working back into the shadows um, and changing some of the color. See, there's definitely some color changes that are happening. A lot more cool tones are being put in here, but I'm not going into the shadows the same way that I'm going into the lights. In the lights, I'm using a lot of opaque paint. There's a lot of thickness, a lot of surface being built. In the shadows, I'm working much more translucently. So I am thinning down the paint with the medium as I'm also doing in these light areas, but I'm taking a tiny bit of solvent and just putting less on the brush and then scrubbing that around into the shadows. And that's getting this really nice translucent effect where it is letting these glazes, these warm glazes, show through from underneath, but it's also starting to cool things down and to change some of the color. And I'm doing the same kind of thing in the eye here. So as I'm working into these shadows, I'm not working opaquely into these shadows. There may be moments when I do that, like there may be some moments in here when I want to work the form a little bit more on the bridge of the nose, or I don't know what else, but you know, I'm definitely going to work a little bit more over here with a bit thicker paint. But the shadows should look transparent. They should have that nice, transparent, soft effect to them. They should not look robust and hard the way that the light areas do. The light areas are reflecting light, but light is kind of like sinking into the shadows. I'm allowing them to be more transparent, and that will better replicate the effect of what actually happens with light because of that. You know, natural light will bounce off, is reflected off of light areas that are being illuminated, but in the shadows you have a lot less light and you have a lot more transparency because of that. So I'm playing with that. Definitely working the drawing too. I never assume that the initial drawing I put on is absolutely correct. I'm always willing to change it. And I've actually lowered the mouth very slightly, which still needs a little bit more work. but I've lowered the mouth. I'm kind of changing the shapes of the eyes a little bit. Um, right now, if things are off, they're only off very slightly, so they're requiring fairly small edits because I spent a lot of time measuring in the beginning. Um, but there's still always little things that change and get off as you're painting. It's kind of like fight to get the drawing back periodically as you're working. But so I'm going to keep working in these shadow tones. I'm going to keep working translucently the way that I am right now. And then we'll touch in again. See what else we need to talk about. All right, so I want to take just a moment here and talk about some way I'm about to alter this paint. So in this shirt, I want the paint that I'm putting down to be kind of broken up. I want the brush strokes to be really gritty. As you just kind of witnessed, after I painted this green on here, I took my palette knife and I scraped it, and that was all intentional. I wasn't trying to scrape off this green, at least not completely. I was trying to scrape away some of it off of the surface so that the area that's underneath starts to show through as well. And that was just a way of kind of roughing up that texture to kind of better simulate the texture that I'm looking at. Because I'm not dealing with skin tones right now, I'm dealing with fabric, which has a very different feel and a very different texture than softer skin. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give a little bit of grit to the paint. And what I'm going to do right now is actually mix a little bit of chalk. It's just like, you know, this is obviously artist grade chalk here. But I'm going to mix a bit of chalk in with the paint because that is going to stiffen the paint without adding any extra oil to it. Because I want to be conscious of the amount of oil that is mixed in with the paint. I will be mixing a little bit of liquid in still, but this chalk is going to give this paint just a little bit of extra extra stiffness and a little bit of extra body. The chalk is actually a transparent substance, at least like, you know, almost completely transparent. it sort of disappears into nothing in paint and is often used as a filler. And in this particular case, I want that filler to be added because it will give a bit of drag to the brush stroke. It'll add a bit of a sculptural, textural quality to it that I can use to to better replicate this texture that is in the shirt. You do want to be careful that you don't add too much chalk into the paint. Unfortunately, I don't have a particularly great barometer of what is too much chalk, but you don't want to add so much chalk that there's no longer enough oil binder mixed in with the paint. So that is the concern there. I'm just going to mix up all of this, I think. But so that's what I'm doing right now. Stay tuned. I will make all of this happen pretty soon, and hopefully you'll be able to see the results of this kind of stiffness in the paint. Okay, so at this point, it's sort of a rinse and repeat type process. I've taken you through the main stages of the Venetian method, and that is, you know, the underdrawing, the grisaille, the glaze, and the scumble. And now what you do to basically finish the painting is to repeat the glaze and scumble. So what I'm actually going to do in the next layer is to start with the glaze in the face, and then while that is still wet, push the painting a bit thicker. I'll work into the middle tones, and I'll start really building out the light tones to work the whole thing wet into wet. And that is really going to help me get a little bit of the transitions of where the skin meets the hair, as well as where the edge of the face is and where that meets the background. It'll help to establish more of the edges between objects, working in a wet into wet process. So I'm going to combine them in the next stage and then kind of see where that goes. Maybe I'll do a glaze after that and then another scumble, or maybe I will combine them again into the same layer. But that is essentially the principles of the Venetian method. So like I said, we kind of rinse and repeat until the painting is done, until you've kind of exhausted the form and the paint quality that you want to establish, or, you know, other intellectual pursuits in the painting. So stay tuned. I will post some more videos about those next steps.